Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. I am Fox, and today I wanted to have a look at how we can achieve the highest burn damage on a standard Eclipse Protocol build. The way we're going to look at this is by factoring in how we can swap out different weapon talents to enhance either the duration or the damage of our burn on our build and see which one comes on top. There are 4 weapons that we'll be looking at today. The Capacitor, the Harmony, the Everlasting Gaze, and the Firestarter, which is the shotgun that comes with the Firewall specialization. For the purpose of this video, the base build will be using Firewall so that we can test out that shotgun, and also as we do gain the 20% additional burn duration. That's an intrinsic talent with Firewall. But usually I would run this with Technician, and if you want to see what I believe to be the best Eclipse Protocol build for 2U12, check the link at the top of your screens now and in the description below. That uses Technician and everything else that's the same on this build to achieve extremely high damage with the combination of Memento and Capacitor. And yes, this combination does indeed achieve even more damage than running the Eclipse Protocol backpack with Vial. The damage numbers will show higher there, but the ridiculous amount of skill efficiency which buffs every single part of our build, and even the weapon damage when paired with Capacitor, it just wins. It's simply the best in slot. So check that video out. The build is basically the same as this. We are running the 4-piece Eclipse with every piece rolled to status effects. Because we don't have the +1 skill tier from Technician, this is still a skill tier 6 build with everything rolled to yellow. So as you can see here, all skill tier status effects. We're running the single piece Golan, which gives us the 10% status effects rolled to yellow, and then we have the Memento backpack, which gives us a large amount of skill efficiency buffs to enhance what this can do. We're in the firing range, so we won't actually have any of those buffs, so please bear in mind that your numbers in the standard heroic mission will be considerably higher than the ones that you see today. So that's the base build that we're looking at just there. What we're going to do first of all is go through what the base damage is on this build without any buffs applied at all. We're then going to go through the 4 weapons, and then I'm going to show you a secret combo that can actually achieve more damage than any of the individual weapons that we look at today. That's well worth going to that part as well. This will all be timestamped below, so don't worry about that. And just before we start that testing, I do just want to make you all aware of a couple of important things with Eclipse that I'm not sure everybody is aware of. So the first of these 2 tips is that damage to armor and skill damage both buff the status effect damage stat. So we're not talking about status effect duration, but we're talking about burn and bleed. If you have any damage to armor on your build, so you see my Everlasting Gaze is rolled to damage to armor, this will enhance the per tick burn and bleed damage versus an armored target in PvE and in PvP. This is also true for skill damage. So for example, if you had a Wyvern here, that would still do more damage than not having a Wyvern here. Golan achieves the highest because status effects buffs both the duration and damage, but damage to armor and skill damage buff just the damage side of it. So even Contractors would be a possible option on this build. It will do less than Golan, but if you don't have any Golan or Wyvern, Contractors would actually work on this build if you of course had the +1 skill tier from Technician. The second tip is that, or important bit of information, is that any status effect that is applied takes into consideration all of your skill damage and your buffs on your weapon at that exact moment. So for example, if you built up all of your stacks on your Capacitor and then applied the status effect, even once those 40 stacks have run out on your Capacitor, that increased damage would continue as long as the status effect lasted, and if it passed to another enemy via Eclipse Protocol's indirect transmission talent, it would still retain that additional damage. So even if the weapon buff is very temporary, as long as it is active when the initial status effect is applied, it will be indefinite. So with that in mind, what we're now going to do is go into the firing range and have a look at a base damage test first of all. So what we have done here is selected a named boss in a heroic world. You can see in the bottom center of your screens next to my radar it says heroic. This is a named boss, and the reason for that is that the higher difficulty the boss, the more resistance it has to status effects. Now that doesn't lower the damage, so the damage of your status effect would be the same in any content, but what it does do is lower the duration. These bosses have the highest duration, so how we're going to perform today's test is to look at the per tick damage, so essentially what each burn tick does, and how many notches of armor are remaining on this boss in front of us. You want to set your video to 1080p if you haven't already done so, and you should be able to see that there are 9 individual white armor notches. So we're just going to see how many of those are left. To start with, for our base damage test, we're going to fire the sticky bomb with no buffs active, but we are going to leave the Capacitor in our hand at all times because this has 12% damage to armor, and this is what you would naturally do with whatever weapon you had anyway. So just to make it a fair test, we'll use that weapon for everyone. So you can see there that our base damage is exactly 294k. What we're now going to do is see how many notches of armour are left over once this runs out, and this will then be our baseline for all of the 4 weapons that we're going to be testing. So I see that as 5.5, the 6th one there is greyed out, so we're just going to count those as a half. So we saw the damage there, 294k, 5.5 armour notches left on the boss. What we're now going to do is move up to a fully stacked capacitor. So with the capacitor we do of course have that 12% damage to armour, which we already know enhances our damage, but what we also have is the capacitance talent. Shooting enemies builds stacks to a cap of 40. Each stack grants 1.5% skill damage, and then after 5 seconds the stacks do start to decay until of course you start firing again. So this equates to 60% total skill damage at 40 stacks, and the weapon itself has 41 bullets, so in theory you should be able to achieve max stacks, 1 mag or 2 mags absolute worst. Because we now know that skill damage also enhances the per tick damage of our burn, let's see what this equates to. So I'm going to build up some stacks on a different target. So I don't want to damage our main target and skew the figures. So we're now at 40 stacks, as you can see on the side of the gun. Pop this in, and you can already see that our per tick damage is at 443k. So this is drastically higher than when we had this weapon out with 0. And you can see that whilst my stacks are going down, the damage isn't changing, which again confirms that as long as the buff is active at the moment the first status effect is applied, that then lasts as long as the status effect lasts, even through the EP transmission. So we know that the base left us with 5.5 armour notches on the boss. You can already see here that this is only 3.5. So we've definitely done substantial more damage to a target that essentially has tens of millions of HP. So that's the capacitor. What we're now going to do is have a look at the Harmony, which was essentially the go-to for skill builds before Capacitor came out. So the Harmony came out in TU10. This gives us the perfectly in sync talent, which as long as we fire a single bullet into an enemy first will give us a total of 40% skill damage, as if you read the bottom paragraph it states that those bonuses are doubled when simultaneously active. To make the test fair, we are going to swap back to the capacitor, even though this is rolled to damage to armour, which is correct for any skill or status damage build. We just want to make them all the same, so I'm going to fire a bullet into the enemy, and then I'm going to fire the skill into the enemy, which will, as it was all applied with the first status effect, retain that 40% damage throughout, and then we're going to switch to the capacitor. Let's see how we get on. So we're going to fire a shot into this enemy, we're going to fire a skill into this enemy, and then we're going to swap to the capacitor. So this is at 343k per tick now, which is obviously a lot higher than base damage, which was only 278, but of course nowhere near the exactly 100k more capacitor at 443k per tick. This has left us with 5 notches exactly, so it's not that much more damage than base, which was 5.5 notches, but just bear in mind that these bosses do have tens of millions of HP, so it may not seem like a huge amount more, but it is still more. So we already knew that the Harmony was never going to be as good damage, because of course it's 40% versus 60% with the capacitor, but you only have to fire 1 bullet with this, so if you prefer to sit in cover and play a lot more safely, then this could still be a great option versus the capacitor, where you are constantly firing into enemies and therefore drawing a lot more aggro. So it's all based on your playstyle. The next weapon that we're going to move on to will be the Everlasting Gaze. So with the Everlasting Gaze we do gain the perfect version of the Perpetuation talent. You can see I've already rolled this to damage to armour, again in the correct way as this buffs our damage, but of course we are going to be switching to the capacitor anyway. Headshots grant 50% status effect damage and duration. So the damage is lower than the capacitor, but the duration is higher, and it'll be interesting to see how this fares out. The perfect version means the cooldown is only 16 seconds, the non-perfect is only 20, so you don't need to use a named item, but if you're going to use a status build with Perpetuation, you might as well go for this. And don't forget that using the foam means it's very easy to apply that headshot. Once again, like the other buffs we've spoken about, if we have this active before we apply that initial status effect, even when it runs out, it will maintain that increased status effect damage and duration for the entirety of the status effect, including when it passes over. So I know I'm kind of repeating myself with this, but I just want to make that point very clear. If you were to apply your burn sticky bomb and then after that do perfect perpetuation, it will be used up when it transfers to another enemy via Eclipse Protocol, but it will not apply the enhanced damage, so it's a wasted buff. So always have this active first before you apply your first status effect. Luckily, once it's applied, it stays there until you die or weapon swap. So I can reload and retain the buff, I can fire more shots, I can miss shots. This is now always on the gun. So this is why Perfect Perpetuation is fantastic for status builds. But is it going to be as good as the capacitor? Let's find out. So I did swap a little bit late there, but 378k damage, which is pretty high. That's the second highest so far, but still not the 443k. However, with the increased duration, we're down to... Actually, that turned out just a little bit better. So that was actually just over 3 notches. It wasn't quite 3.5, which is what our capacitor was on. So this weapon turns out to be pretty much the same, if not better. And it seems like it's better than even the capacitor, especially as you only need to fire that one bullet into the enemy's head. And as long as you don't weapon swap and lose it, you will essentially retain that buff. If I can hit my headshots. So far, the... Everlasting Gaze, which is easily obtained, is best in slot for overall damage, but the DPS of this is a lot lower, as of course the capacitor just, spikes harder, the per tick damage is higher. What we're now going to do is move on to the final weapon of this testing before we hit the secret combo, the Firestarter shotgun, which comes from the Firewall specialization. So this is a sidearm, which means it has infinite ammo, only 2 in the mag, but as long as you can hit the enemy, regardless of the damage you apply, you will apply the primer rounds debuff. Damaged enemies lose 50% burn resistance for 5 seconds. So that resistance in these primer rounds is the same resistance we were talking about earlier in the tips section of the video, with regards to legendary and certain ads having more resistance than others. So this won't give us more damage per tick, but it will increase the duration by essentially debuffing the enemy's resistance to that duration, if that makes sense. And just like all the other skills that we've spoken about today, yes, this does transfer through Eclipse Protocol long after it's run out and after you've swapped off of the weapon. It always takes that base buff and debuff information when that first status effect is applied. Again, to keep the testing fair, we're going to switch over to the capacitor even as soon as we've fired this shot, and we'll see just how much longer that duration is and what total damage that equates to. So full health target. So going to our capacitor afterwards. Okay, here we go. So we're going to fire this, swap over, hit the skill. So that's hitting 294k, which is exactly what we expected. It's the same as the base damage, and we already know that resistance has nothing to do with damage, only duration. So what we're expecting to see here with the 0 stack capacitor out is a much longer duration. Now already we're into somewhere between 3 and 4. This is going to be close. Okay, that was actually 2.5 notches, so that already confirms that this weapon is basically best in slot. So all we're doing is by removing the 50% burn resistance from our enemy, because it lasts so much longer, yes, the burst damage, the DPS is a lot lower than capacitor, so if you're looking to get rid of a low health enemy, this isn't the way to do it. And if you're looking to get rid of an enemy that has low base resistance to begin with, such as a red or purple bar, or just most enemies in hard and challenging, this again isn't best in slot. But in heroic versus gold bars, named enemies, and especially in legendary with that 75% resistance, that's where you're going to get the most gains from the Firestarter, and versus those enemies, this will allow you to have a ridiculous duration, particularly if when you switch over to a weapon that has damage to armor, as long as the target itself has armor, so this obviously won't work against heavies and warhounds, then yeah, you're just going to do more total damage. So that's now top of the list, the Firestarter. The secret combo, I'm sure you've already figured it out. I basically wanted to see if we could combine any of these two. I was thinking, well, one applies a debuff to the enemy, and the other applies a buff to yourself that you only lose if you swap your weapons. So if we apply the buff after the debuff, in theory, we should be able to combine them. And that's exactly what we're about to do. By utilising the Firestarter, we then go over to the Everlasting Gaze, which was the second best overall damage, and hit that headshot whilst the Firestarter primer rounds buff is still active. We then fire the burn sticky bomb into the target whilst we have the perpetuation and debuff active. And the fourth and final action is we switch to the capacitor for the 12% damage to armor. Now I know that sounds like a lot of actions and it is a bit of a weird wombo combo, but versus bosses that you have already foamed, if you get into the habit of doing this, you're going to achieve some ridiculous damage. Let's see exactly what we're talking about. Right then, so again we're going to do that exact 4-step process and see what kind of damage we can achieve. So I'm on the capacitor with 0 stacks. You can see we're hitting 378k per tick, which lines up quite nicely with the test that we've had before. So we're gaining the increased damage from perpetuation, the increased duration from perpetuation, and the increased duration from the resistance debuff. This is already looking pretty good. Look how much time is left on that. We're going to kill this target? I think we're going to kill this target. And now you can see that increased damage is passed on. It's showing a lower 338k number there because they're health, so damage to armor doesn't affect them. But versus this target, oh wow, this is disgusting. It's actually going to kill that one too. Okay, so there you go. That was considerably more damage. It's still going. This gets reduced by 25% each time it passes, so yeah, I'm quite impressed at how long this is lasting for, but there you go, that 370k number in the bottom right there just confirms it. So even though we lost our buffs absolutely ages ago, even though it came back to this target, what, 30-40 seconds later, it still had the same perpetuation damage increase and the duration increase from those two stats as well, with the obviously the shotgun being the second one. Yes, it gets reduced each time with every transmission pass, but ultimately more duration is more duration. So that's the testing just there. If you do want to run a burn specific build, I would highly recommend that you run all three of these weapons because you want to follow that wombo combo. If you need the burst damage versus lower health enemies, you need to be using the Capacitor, as it does win out at 443k per tick. If you are against a high resistance, high health boss, you want to be doing the wombo combo of the Firestarter over to the perfect perpetuation and then apply your burn before ideally finishing on the Capacitor to give yourself the 12% damage to armor. Unfortunately, your card builds up stacks then because the status effect has already been applied and it won't work, but ultimately the 12% is enough to make a big difference. That's the end of the video. Thank you very much if you did watch through to the end. Please let me know of any questions you have in the comments section, and until then, I will see you all in the next video.